Why hello, I'm Andy and I'm here at home celebrating Metro's 50th anniversary here in Washington, D.C. To celebrate this milestone, I thought it would be a fun idea to look at some of Metro's early designs for its stations and its associated infrastructure, as well as a few photographs from its construction. To do this, we're going to delve into an archive currently held at the George Washington University Libraries that has a bunch of WMATA historic artifacts that we are going to look at to really get a glimpse of what Metro could have been and what it eventually became, the system that we know and love today. And so with that, I hope you'll join me as we begin this journey into some Metro history. It's time to explore the DC Metro's early designs. Now, before we get into specific stations, let's take a look at some of the standardized and general designs of stations across the system that you can find in this archive. For instance, if you look here, you can find a section of a typical side platform underground station. As you can see, as they're planning the mezzanine, the waffle-style architecture, not too different from what we see today. The archive also has some incredible renderings, drawings, architectural drawings really, of different elements of the station, such as this lovely one of just a typical pedestrian underpass, or this one of a bike storage area outside of a station where, frankly, unsure what station this is supposed to be. A lot of these drawings are really just generalized for the whole system, ideas of what different elements of the station would look like before construction would begin. Now, what's really cool though is that in this archive you can find various alternative designs for the Metro system. Many from a period in the late 60s, nearly a decade before Metro would open, when Harry Weiss, the main architect for Metro, was testing out different designs with the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, specifically with one of the commission's members, Gordon Bunshaft. While approval was not necessarily needed from the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, their approval would carry some weight and be very helpful in getting approval from other relevant entities in D.C. Now, Gordon Bunshaft didn't really like some of these proposed designs, specifically the ones with exposed rock walls, which he thought looked like a coal shaft. And ultimately, we got the sort of oval-shaped design, the arced walls with the waffle design and so on that has become so iconic of the Metro today. Nonetheless, it's really cool to see these generalized Metro designs of almost an alternate reality of what the stations could have looked like. Now, you may have noticed a difference in image quality between some of the renderings here, and that's because not all the collection is digitized. However, we were able to go to the George Washington University Library to take a look at the non-digitized collection. Now, other elements of the stations had design renderings for them too. Everything from trash cans to the materials that were to be used in the Metro station, such as the classic hexagonal tile, and elevators, like you can see here in this 1973 rendering of an elevator at Judiciary Square Station. For those Metro historians out there, you may know that Metro was almost built without elevators. For a while, they were actually looking to install incline elevators, which we found an actual rendering of in the archive, but those plans fell through. Metro is accessible thanks to a disability activist group led by Richard Hedinger, filing a federal lawsuit and making elevators required in all Metro stations, with the decision being made in June of 1973. Now, this rendering was made only a month after that decision, in July of 1973. Why the quick turnaround? Well, by this point in time, construction had already begun on the Metro system, which meant that some elevators had to be built in places where the concrete had already been cast. This resulted in odd situations like having fare gates on the platform at stations like Judiciary Square. And you'll also find in this archive some other sort of unique Metro renderings, artwork, somewhere in between, such as this image, which shows the Metro going beneath quiet, quaint homes that are above. Now, this image that we believe was a companion to the other image seems to suggest the reason why these images were made, to show that the Metro going deep underground is not going to have a big impact on noise and vibration for the homes above. And with that, it's time to start looking at the designs of specific stations we found in the archive. We'll be looking at different stations in chronological order as the stations opened. As you may have guessed, this archive is giant, and we couldn't discuss every rendering or every station in this video. However, If you enjoyed this video and would be interested in seeing a follow-up, let me know in the comments. Now we'll start with our specific station designs with Farragut North and Farragut West. Why do I include both? Well, for this first rendering, we're actually looking at Farragut Square, which, while not showing you an early design, is still a very cool rendering of what the subterranean space beneath Farragut Square looks like. Because here, as you can see, the blue, orange, and silver line does indeed cross over the red line with a connecting track that connects the two lines. Now, some of you who know a little bit about Metro history will remember that Farragut North and Farragut West were originally supposed to be one station until the National Park Service intervened because they didn't like the idea of having a major transfer station with an entrance on Farragut Square. Now, we were able to find one single design of what that station might have looked like, unfortunately not from the underground portion of the station, but what it would have looked like coming up to Farragut Square. Now with this slide, you can see the escalators that would have led up from this transfer station right into Farragut Square, specifically right to that statue of Admiral Farragut. Now our next stop on the initial segment that opened 50 years ago is Metro Center, where you can find a 1967 very early rendering of what the station would have looked like, and it's pretty crazy to see. For one, you can see how the walls haven't really made that distinct waffle shape, but I think more importantly, or even more crazily, you have a flip of how the station is layered. For those of you who have used Metro Center, you know that the bottom layer, the lower level, is an island platform for the blue, orange, silver line. The upper level are two side platforms for the red line. But here, it's reversed. The lower level has the side platforms, the upper level has the island platform, which makes for a very weird, very floating aspect of the upper level, and makes you wonder how they managed to get the exits out of the lower level here without sort of colliding with the tracks above and having enough space for passenger flow. In the non-digitized collection, however, we were able to find this plan for Metro Center that matches the rendering and answers that question to a certain degree. The corridors going off the lower level would lead to staircases to the upper island platform, where you could then access two exits at either end. But this does still seem like a bad idea for passenger flow, and I wondered what other questions were being asked at this stage about that. Perhaps these questions are what ultimately led to the two levels being reversed, but nonetheless, it's a really cool design to look at, and just another example of all the iterations that our metro system went through. Also in the archive for Metro Center is this rendering that's a little closer to what we actually got with the beautiful waffle-style architecture that we all know and love. What's interesting though is that the archive had not just one of these types of renderings, but two. And in this one, you'll notice that the trains that are being used, they look a little different than the trains we have today. But in the other rendering, you'll notice that the trains are a lot closer to what we eventually got. Now, the other difference between this image and the rendering before is the presence of pylons that you can see on the platforms at the red line level. Here at Metro Center, we also see the first in the archive of the models that were built to show off what these stations would look like in 3D space. For Metro Center, you can see different photographs taken by Larry Levine of the platform and mezzanine levels with some pylons to show, and I think some really lovely people that were cut out of various different colors. Here's another image showing the mezzanine level and showing the circular, tubular style of the metro stations that we all know today. And here's an image of a model showing one of the passageways to an escalator bank to exit Metro Center Station. And in this final rendering that we'll show you from the archive of Metro Center Station, you can see the sales office for Metro here on the upper level platforms. What's also interesting though is you have this circular horizontal map that looks very similar to the maps you can find in L'Enfant Plaza Station today. And to note, L'Enfant Plaza is the only station where you can actually find these kinds of maps. Now the next station on the Metro that was part of that initial opening segment was Judiciary Square, not Gallery Place. That hadn't actually opened yet. We'll get to that in just a little bit. Now, with Judiciary Square, you can see one of the early 1967 designs where you don't have that curved tubular design or waffle architecture. Instead, you have these flat, almost rock faces along the side with these large columns that sort of jut out of the walls. And these lights that sort of rise up as almost like a proto-pylon to illuminate the station. It's a very different design that we can see a more refined version of in the next rendering that was found in the archive. Now in this more refined rendering, you can still see the flat walls and the flat ceiling, but the mezzanine stays about the same with what we eventually got in our underground metro stations. The lamps you can see a little more clearly in this version than the previous version, and frankly I think they look a little bit like the lamps you might find at IKEA for $15 to $20 depending on inflation. Nonetheless, this rendering comes from an era where Harry Weiss was trying to present to the US Commission of Fine Arts what design would eventually get approved by them. And so there was a debate about whether to use this design or, of course, the waffle design that Weiss worked with Bundschaft to develop, and is of course what we eventually got. Renderings were also done for what the station would look like above ground. Here, as actually pretty close to what it ended up looking like right in front of the National Building Museum, but also a version with a canopy, something that metro stations very rarely came with until the initiative decades later with the canopies we all recognize today. But here, you can see a very early style for a metro canopy. Judiciary Square in the archives also has photographs of the model, but more specifically, a photograph of what we assume is Larry Levine, although this isn't confirmed, taking the photograph of the model. And you can see some of his work in the next few slides. Here you can see a close-up shot of the platforms and the train car itself with what looks like a very early Metro logo before the M came in, showing what are 3 intersecting lines. And finally, this one that I picked out to show, or to share, because it actually shows that these early cars had 4 doors instead of 3 per car, with these little single doors by the cabs of the vehicles. And in this photo, you can see a rail car model that looks pretty similar to what we'd eventually get, even with the finished Metro M logo. But what is this? What you can see here is a Metro car in red. And that's because Metro did consider having cars that were painted in a single color, with red being ones that they made models and some paintings for as well. Now this would last all the way up to the early 70s until it was cut for cost concerns, but I still think the Metro colors that we got, or the Metro designs I should say, that we got still look pretty smart. Now our next station after Judiciary Square isn't actually a station, or is it? I mean, if you look at this photo, it looks like a typical office building in downtown DC, but what it actually is the Jackson Graham Building, Metro's first headquarters, and this model shows what they wanted it to look like. Included in the archive are renderings of what different meeting rooms would have looked like, as well as outdoor landscaping. But to me, most excitingly, they had floor plans for most of the floors of the building, as you can see right here. And perhaps most interestingly, you can see a floor plan of the basement level of the Jackson Graham Building, and you can see the tracks of the red line cutting the building diagonally. Now, why is this important? For those Metro nerds like me, you might know that the Jackson Graham Building in downtown DC was where the money train would stop. Yes, the famous yellow money train to unload its precious cargo into the building that was all the revenue generated by all the stations. But how would they do that? Well, they had a little platform that you can see here where the train would stop, unload the money, and go through these doors into the aptly named revenue collection rooms. And it just is so cool to be able to see the floor plan of the Jackson Graham Building showing how this would work. Moving on to Union Station, we have another lovely early rendering of what one of the entrances would have looked like. This one on the west side of the station, the one that leads to the open air. Now, in this early rendering, you can see an outline of the Capitol, but most interestingly to me is this circle right here, which I think could be a proto-Metro logo, although it looks a lot like the Boston Tea logo. But if you know anything more about this, please feel free to drop some hints in the comments. Now, this rendering would actually get an update, a real refresh, I might add, in the next scene from the archives, where frankly, it doesn't really change too much other than removing the T logo, but I just think this is such a beautiful rendering. Like, honestly, Metro, if you sold these as like framed photos, I would buy one. Also in this archive is a rendering of the interior of Union Station, which again looks pretty similar to what was eventually built. But one thing I want to note was that everyone in this rendering are wearing suits, which is interesting. Also included in the archive is another photo of another model, this one that cleverly uses a mirror to extend the model a little deeper to really get the feel of the scale of what these stations would look like. And again, for this one in particular, this is very, very close to what was ultimately built, if not exactly what was built. And moving now to the terminus of that initial segment of the metro system that was opened 50 years ago is Rhode Island Avenue Station, where you can see in the late 60s renderings the view from the side and the view from above, where you can see the red metro trains once again, as well as a ton of parking. Also with Rhode Island Avenue, in the archive you can find photographs of an early model of the station where it's pretty similar to what was built, except for a different style roof canopy than what was ultimately built, which is more accurate in this photo of a different model. And what I'll give props to this model as well is how beautiful it looks like in the dark. And with that, we've covered the initial opening stations of the Metro. We'll quickly go to Gallery Place Station, where we weren't able to find too much in the archive, but we were able to find this trying to explain how wheelchair users could navigate the station through the real maze of elevators that are very obviously added after the station was truly designed. It becomes very painfully obvious here because even, frankly, I transfer at the station almost every day, yet I can't really follow all the lines here. And that was the reason why that station opened later than the rest. Also opening a little later, but just a little later after the initial segment, was Dupont Circle Station, where you can see in this 1967 rendering that early design of the flat walls, although here more of a vaulted roof. But you still got the IKEA lamps here up in the middle of the station. You can see these other lovely renderings that are more refined. You can see the escalators that are going straight down from the surface level into the station. And finally, this rendering of an alternate location for the elevator at Dupont Circle. If you've ever used it, you know it sort of stands by itself behind the main escalator bank at Q Street, but here it was actually to be built inside one of the neighboring buildings. And now moving into Virginia, we arrive at Rosslyn Station, where the archive has some great photographs of the Rosslyn Station model, as you can see here with that magnificent escalator bank that is now actually just a little slower than the high-speed elevators that were built across the street. Nonetheless, it's still very cool to look at, whether in real life or in model form. Also present from 1969 is a model that uses transparent plastic, I assume, to provide and show the waffle-style architecture of the station, but also letting viewers look into the station itself. I think this is a genius idea for a model of one of the metro stations. Now, also included in the archive aren't just early designs of the metro stations themselves, but later renderings and models of later changes to the station. And one of those changes that hit many stations is the installation of different forms of artwork. And in Rosslyn, you have Y. David Chung's 2000-piece Scenes of Rosslyn, which you can see in this 1996 photograph being modeled so that people could see what it looked like. Now, this part of the artwork looks pretty similar, actually. Looks identical to what was installed. But the archives has photographed parts of the mural I've never seen before, parts that weren't installed around the station. This is in the back and along the sides where the murals just weren't installed there. Now, also in the archive, you can find other forms of artwork for the station that were just never built, like this entrance for the escalator bank on the main side, where it's meant to look like a metro car, which is very interesting. Or how about the back side, where that little entrance is, where they were going to spruce it up with, it says here, images of Rosslyn in the openings, and of course a giant Metro M to complement it all. Or how about coloring the brutalist architecture within and above the escalator bank, or even adding these giant, like what I assume are maybe neon tubes of light to go down the escalator bank. Now this actually looks like an installation at Exchange Place on the PATH station, but I digress. Nonetheless, it's really interesting to see not just early renderings of what stations could look like, but also what the artwork in stations could look like as well. Now, as the Metro was expanding eastward along what would become the blue, orange, and silver lines, you have around the RFK Stadium not just Stadium Armory Station, but an Oklahoma Avenue Station, which was actually canceled due to community pushback. But here, in the archives, you can see a rendering of what that station would have looked like. And hey, with the new Commander Stadium coming in, wouldn't be a bad idea to maybe think about putting the station in once again. Looking at the 1978 Red Line extension to Silver Spring, one of the stations on this route, a very important station, is Brookland-CUA, one of the only two real stations to have small curvatures in their platform. But in the archives, you can find this 1969 site plan of what the station would have looked like, and frankly, it's kind of a worse design than what was actually built. If you look around here, the station looks about the same. Now, just for reference, this is the CUA campus to the north and the development that's occurred here, the new Trader Joe's and all that. And to the south is the Park and Ride and the Brooks Mansion, which is down around here. And very similar to what was built, you have an entrance that goes towards the bus bay and the parking. But what if you wanted to get to the other side, where a lot of the transit-oriented development and the university is? Well, for that, you'd have to exit, walk all the way around and cross Michigan Avenue to board this, or to climb onto this little pedestrian bridge to then finally get to the other side of the tracks. Although, of course, you could also just walk across these bridges as well, but so much more inconvenient than what was actually built, which frankly was a very good design change. But it's nice to see how these site plans evolved over time. For Silver Spring, we're not looking at the early renderings of the station because from what's in the archive, it's pretty similar to what was ultimately built. But there are some 1988 renderings that are very interesting that were in the archive for the Paul S. Sarbanes Transit Center that is right next to the Silver Spring Station. And in here, you can see that the transit center has some massive transit-oriented development on top of it. And in these lovely renderings, you can see how it would have interacted with the giant transfer station that was meant to be built below it. But what I think is really interesting here is, now despite this being made in 1988, what do you see here but a little proto-purple line? It's a little more obvious here in this really amazing section of what the transit center would have been layered, almost like a cake here. But then there again, there it is, the purple line in 1988. Let's hope it opens soon. Looking in Arlington at Courthouse Station with these 1972 renderings, where you can see a normal looking entrance, and it's a little unclear where exactly this is, but you can see there's the pylon, there's the entrance. What's really interesting is the next rendering, where you can see what looks to be almost like a festival marketplace with a brutalist roof. To be clear, it still appears to be the metro station. Hey, look, there's what I assume are escalators down to the mezzanine or to even to the platform. But look, there's like curtains or like drapes and like possibly vendors selling things. A very interesting idea for a station that frankly does have a lot of space underground that isn't used very much. Now for Woodley Park Station, the archive has some incredible early designs from 1967 that we've seen for a few other stations, but they go really in depth here. We really get some views that we haven't gotten yet so far in our journey through the archive. Well, here at Woodley Park, we have a rendering at the street level where you can see a very early metro canopy and almost a triangle shape. And if you remember from the Union Station early rendering, here's that T logo again. Again, possibly early metro logo. Now going down underground, you can see the mezzanine, which is pretty similar to how it was ultimately built, but a couple key differences, of course, with this design. One, the flat walls and what looks to be exposed rock. That's what Bunchef called the coal shaft look, but it still looks really cool. And here, not a flat roof, but a curved roof that sort of arches above the flat wall part of the station. But again, there is still a lot of similarities, again, with the mezzanine, as I mentioned before, but where the fare gates are, where the kiosk is, the lights on the platform that warn you when the train is arriving, there's both a lot that's radically different, but a lot that should feel pretty familiar to most metro users. And now, I just love this, looking at the side platform level. Another thing, here at Woodley Park Station is a side platform station in real life, of course. It's a island platform station where you can just see folks waiting for the train, going up and down the escalator, and you can really get a feel of what it would have felt like to be in this early concept of the metro station with the exposed rock, the concrete, and the curved roof. Van Ness Station, a little further up the Red Line, also has early 1967 rendering here in the archive, where the fare gates are actually at a pretty high level. Basically, as soon as you go down to sort of the undercarriage beneath Connecticut Avenue, that's where the fare gates would have been. You would have gone down there with view of natural light coming down, and then you would have gone underground to what I assume would be the mezzanine and then the platform. Still crazy to see these different sides of what these early 1967, late 60s renderings looked like for an early concept of what the metro could have looked like. We're heading to Alexandria for the first time in our journey through the archive here to King Street Old Town Station, where we're going to look at some issues with the canopy. Here, really hard to tell from this nice, very beautiful sketch from 1972, but in 1973 you get a rendering with the very typical concrete roof that you see in a lot of the other surface and above ground and elevated stations on the metro system. If you've been to Alexandria stations, King Street Old Town or Braddock Road, you'll know they don't have these roofs because there's a whole debate about historic preservation and trying to keep in line with the local area. And now this is the rendering from 1973. 2 years later, you get a very similar rendering with the roofs switched out. And this is, of course, what you see today if you go to either Braddock Road or King Street Old Town Station. Going a little further south, we're at Huntington Station, the terminus of the Yellow Line, where in this very early 1969 site plan of the station, you can see it was meant to be a very simple station, much simpler than it is now. If you're familiar with the station, you know it has 2 exits, one that you have to go down to, one you have to go up to, there's an incline elevator, there's all sorts of stuff going on here. It was just going to be very simple, 1 exit, 1 level to a massive surface parking lot. When you get to the 1974 rendering in the archive, it's pretty close to what was built. And of course, with the very distinctive supports here with the big circle cut out, very unique. But as we're going to see through this archive, this wasn't meant to be the only station with this style of architecture. On the Red Line extension to Shady Grove, there was Nicholson Lane Station, which would be ultimately changed really very close to opening to White Flint Station, which is now known as North Bethesda Station. It's a whole thing. But here, in this rendering of the station from 1975, it looks pretty similar to what was built. But the next rendering you're going to see is pretty crazy, because it looks just like Huntington Station, because North Bethesda, White Flint, Nicholson Lane, whatever you want to call it, was supposed to have these distinctive supports just like Huntington. You can see that also here from this aerial image. You can see there are the supports again. Ultimately, that wasn't the case, but it's very interesting to know that Huntington Station wasn't supposed to be the only station with that unique architectural feature. Now on to West Falls Church Station, which early on was called Route 7 Station, as you can see here in this section, where you can see it only has 2 tracks, where now it's sort of famously known as being one of the few 3-track stations in the system. This later 1972 rendering now does have it with 3 tracks, but if we look at the rendering from above, it does show some interesting differences. For one, this side is actually pretty similar with the pedestrian bridge all glassed in, but here you have this pedestrian bridge that goes across I-66 over to the areas north of the station, which of course was never built. What was built, as you can see in this later rendering or more refined rendering here, is the bus loop that was to the north of the station, and here's the connection, which is very similar to what was built, which of course is now very much abandoned and really used as parking for Metro employees. But here you can see sort of the final design of the West Falls Church Station. Looking at Shaw Howard University Station, this rendering from the 1990s has one distinct difference, as you may have noticed, a different style of entrance for the station, with this sort of concrete block that goes around, which was going to be used to display the station name. This type of entrance was also present at the U Street Station on the side here, where it lines up with the African American Civil War Memorial, which also has a different design in this rendering. Now moving on to the extension to Anacostia, which did not open until 1991, the reason why I show this rendering, which is the only one we could find in the archives, is not so much that anything really changed. You can see the distinctive architecture of Anacostia Station is pretty much the same in this rendering, but that the rendering was made in 1979 to show just how much time it took between all these designs being drafted up and the station actually being built, due to a lot of changes with the Green Line south of DC. Looking at the Green Line extension to Branch Avenue, we're now looking at another station that was never actually built, Alabama Avenue Station. which was never built because the Green Line was routed elsewhere towards Congress Heights, Naylor Road, Southern Avenue, not in that order, but Alabama Avenue Station did have some renderings here, as you can see here and here, where you can see that the station was a side platform service level station. Moving forward a little bit in time, we're at NoMa Station, where you can see this 2000 rendering, which is similar in architecture to what was ultimately built, but with a different set of entrances, or should I say no set of entrances, because here there was just a single entrance closer to the south side of the station, not the two entrances and the corridor that connects them that people know today. By 2001, you do have two different entrances, but still a little bit different, given that I'm assuming they didn't have a general idea of what was going to be built in terms of transit-oriented development next to the station. Now looking at downtown Largo, which was built around the same time as NoMa, you can see that originally this station was supposed to have a single level of entry instead of the dual level of entry, one above and one a little bit below, that we have today. And finally, the last station we're going to look at is the most recent station to open on the Metro system, Potomac Yard Station, which opened up in 2023. However, this rendering dates back to 1997 and looks pretty different than what was ultimately built. For one, the canopy is a radically different design than what was built, but also look at this, a connecting passageway to what looks like a Virginia Railway Express station with an island platform. And in terms of where exactly this would be, it's still a little unclear where this would be in relationship to the station that exists today, but it's really cool to see a very early design for Potomac Yard Station, of course, Metro's newest station. And with that, we've given you just a sampling of the many treasures within the archive at George Washington University Libraries. It's really a treasure trove here. So many of these renderings are frankly just really beautiful. I mean, this one, for example. But they also show just how much work and effort and different designs and time that went into the design of the Metro system. Also in this archive, which I'll show a few samples of this too, are the various construction photos that were taken by Larry Levine during the construction of Metro, which show the men and women who worked tirelessly to actually get the Metro built. I highly encourage you all to look through the digitized collections online and to see for yourself just the amount of effort and work both in design and in construction that went into building this incredible system as it celebrates its 50th birthday. And here's to the next 50 years. I'm Andy, and until the next time, I'll see you on the Metro.